In this lecture, we will be taking a closer look at the persistence of racism. This represents a second part to our initial discussion of institutionalized racism, and we'll be focusing on some of the ideas that were brought forward by Shirley Better in her primer on social change. Her look at, in this case, some of the individual and institutional qualities that contribute to the persistence of racism in a society like that which we find in the United States is very similar to what we see with the work of the Howard University scholar Douglas Glasgow and his very early writings regarding the welfare state and the idea that welfare itself acts as a system of subsistence that has negative effects on the overall quality of life for people who are attempting to, in a sense, move from one socioeconomic level within the society to the next. Of course, we know since 1971, when Glasgow initially took a look at public relief programs, there has been a significant amount of reform, and we have seen some very positive impacts that have been made by some of this reform. However, there are qualities of the Glasgow argument that still persist today. One of the first things that in her primer Shirley Better addresses is this idea of cultural blindness, and she frames it in relation to the topic of why racism, why inequality, as a byproduct of that sentiment or sentimentality, why, in a sense, that continues to persist. And the idea here of cultural blindness and deafness is something that she expands on considerably in her work. She provides us with a definition for cultural blindness and deafness. She writes in her primer that it relates to the unwillingness to acknowledge that racism is not simply the resistance of the few to the equality for all, but the refusal to witness the embedded inequality within the very social institutions that maintain the society. And this particular perspective is very much that of, or typical of, a sociological point of view. The idea that, in a sense, there are actual structural pieces to the society that are bound up in these social institutions that allow inequality to persist. And at the heart of this is the concept of discrimination. Now, according to Better and other sociologists, the idea here is that we can see this reflected in the nature of specific cultural or historical events. The example that she uses is the Rodney King incident, including the trial and what came of that in terms of how African Americans and Latinos living within Los Angeles and, of course, the surrounding communities perceived law enforcement and their perceptions regarding, in this case, arrests and conduct during these kinds of situations. However, since this occurrence, we realize that there has been a concerted effort, both at the federal and state level, to reform the criminal justice system. However, there is still a lot of work to do. In 2018, the United Nations commissioned a report relating to, in this case, racial disparities in the United States and our criminal justice system. And there were a number of trends, demographic trends, that came of this that really highlighted some of this disparity and also highlighted the idea that there was a persistence of pattern with regard to the expression of people of color in our criminal justice system and how they were being treated, and of course, how they were being sentenced and ultimately incarcerated. This report took a look at several years of data and then summarized it. And I'll highlight just a few of the comments from the report itself to kind of elaborate on this kind of cultural and historical trend. So again, quoting from a section on policing in this report. The authors write, in 2016, African Americans comprised 27% of all individuals arrested in the United States. This was double their share of what they represented in terms of the total population at the time. They continued by saying that African American youths accounted for 15% of all U.S. children, yet they made up 35% of the juvenile arrests in 2016 as well. So this is the kind of general disparity that we are seeing in terms of things like arrest rates as it relates to things like policing in the criminal justice system. The idea here is that we have to ask ourselves, what is the potential cause, or what are the contributing factors for those kinds of demographic trends? The data that the committee began to pore over as they were putting together their report took a look at historical trends. It also looked at, in this case, systematic kinds of practices and policies. So they took a look at mass incarceration as it related to policing in low-income areas and the result of that process. They took a look at pre-trial policies and decision making. They were also influencing things like sentencing and sentencing rates. And then they also took a look at the impact of parole and some of the discretionary practices that were associated with, in this case, decision making by parole officers, and of course, state to state, the parole system itself. And there were a number of findings that the report had, and these are things that really, even since 2018, we have seen a lot of attention being turned to, and we've been seeing some of the more positive results of this reform. But in terms of what they concluded, their recommendations included things like an end on this more popularized war on drugs. In their report, they write the United States should substantially end its war on drugs. Specifically, the Department of Justice should reconsider and reduce the volume of low-level drug offenders being prosecuted in the federal court system. So that was one area that they noted that could be reformed, and we do see this with even trends in legalization and how, on a state to state level, these particular legalizing programs or legalizing trends are having an impact on these low-level drug offenses. They also highlighted the need to eliminate mandatory minimum sentences, writing, the United States should eliminate mandatory minimum sentences. Judges should be allowed to consider individual case characteristics when sentencing a defendant in specific cases that they are overseeing. In addition to this, they highlighted things like reducing the use of cash bail, writing, defendants should be detained pretrial only if they pose a safety or flight risk, not because they cannot afford to post bail. That's just one example of the impact of pre-trial policies. And then they go on to talk even more about the idea of adopting things like a policy requiring the use of a racial impact statement. So a lot of training-based kinds of programs to remove racial bias. And then they also ultimately turn to discuss or look more closely at environmental factors in some of these trends, talking about rates of employment and inequalities within the kind of the work system here in the United States. They talk about education and equal access to education, of course, trends in housing, and then, of course, even public safety and community-based programs that would focus on, in this case, reform and education. So, a very good report, something that even organizations such as the United Nations outside of the United States very much took a look at. And again, things that on the surface appear to be things that can be easily addressed and that, in a sense, would have pretty significant impact on the racial disparities that we see in things like the criminal justice system. But this is just one area, again, that Shirley Better is challenging us as members of society to look at. She also highlights the idea of unemployment for a variety of reasons. And then, of course, the disparities in higher ed. And looking at not necessarily at programs designed to directly change that disparity, but to look more broadly, to look at maybe some of the reasons why that disparity exists in the first place. Well, one of the areas that both in the report I just highlighted and in Shirley Better's primer uh, it receives attention is this idea of the labor system in the United States. And what Shirley Better describes as the two-tier system of labor in the United States is something that directly connects to two different topics. First, the idea of economic privilege, but then also the idea of economic advantage as it relates to how individuals can negotiate the employment landscape, how they can, in a sense, move ahead not only in the jobs that they may have, but as they look at the job landscape, to be able to apply for and attain jobs in this case, a higher income bracket. In her discussion of the labor system in the United States, this notion of a tier system, or having, in a sense, a kind of hierarchy within the employment landscape, really is the problem here. We want to, in a sense, break down the tier system to be able to allow all individuals, no matter what their racial or ethnic background, um, allow those individuals to compete for the same jobs equally. So these particular kinds of structural reforms that Shirley Better is highlighting, and again, things that were catalyzed by the civil rights movement, for example, in the 1960s and 1970s, what these reform efforts are designed to do, or hope to do in a sense, is they hope to make the job landscape, the job market, open to all individuals, even newcomers to the American system. So if we have people who are migrating into the United States, contributing to our communities, contributing to our society, are they given the same kinds of um, equalities with regard to job opportunities as people within the culture, in a sense, or within the society? The idea here is that if there are barriers to a migrant group with regard to employment, um, we need to kind of dismantle those. Or if there are situations where, because of a new status within the United States, an individual is relegated to a low tier kind of employment situation, what are the kinds of reforms that can be put in place to be able to prevent that as being the only option for an individual based upon their choice to emigrate to the United States and to join our society? Other kinds of concerns with regard to employment in this two-tier system, as she points out, are exploitative labor practices, and pay inequality would be probably the best example for those kinds of exploitative practices and how they are persisting over time. Today, again, we still see pay inequalities by gender and by racial or ethnic affiliation. The last piece of the puzzle here with regard to this two-part look at institutional kinds of practices is to more closely examine Better's model of racism. And this is something that comes across in the second chapter of her primer. The model, as she points out, illustrates how racism is created, both its cause and its effect. And so she breaks things down into not only institutional practices, but also individual practices. Now, those are contributing to what we find to be a persistence of inequality and the effects that it has on the surrounding society. Now, on the left-hand side of the diagram, we see what ultimately is fueling the persistence. So, what kinds of values, social values, that are part of the fabric of a society, a Western society, and even more specifically, American society, because that is something she's taking a very close look at, how those are fueling some of the trends with regard to persistence of inequality within the history of the society. So she looks at the emphasis on things like achieving an economic privilege. Or social privilege, or in this case, the notion of psychic reward, or the need that an employee or an individual has with regard to experiencing a positive emotion or a sense of fulfillment regarding the position that they have in a society and how they wish to either maintain or improve that position. So this becomes a force both at an individual and institutional level. As Better points out, individual forces relate to visible and often blatant individual actions that inherently exploit or subjugate members of disadvantaged groups. So the idea here is that if there is something in our conduct, how we carry ourselves, how we are conducting ourselves with regard to our employment, if there are community based decisions that we are involved in regarding things like housing, so on and so forth, and if there are disparities that, in a sense, are driving the decisions that we inherently make in relation to those things. These are things that will then reinforce that continuing kind of persistence of inequality. And it may often be the case that we feel justified in having these particular perspectives given an experience we may have had or given a particular um, theme or subject that we have been socialized into. We can also see then institutional effects of this process as well, and we've really kind of gone over this, as has Better in her primer. As is the case with individual forces in an institutionalized system, things like psychic reward, uh, ideology, even social and historical kinds of attitudes and ideas help the concept of inequality to persist over time and, in a sense, almost hard bakes these kinds of inequality into the fabric of a society because it is now at an institutional level. And this, of course, can lead to violence, and we have seen that in recent history. The idea that when we have something, a force such as bigotry, being institutionalized and, of course, being embodied at an individual level, people begin to act on this state of mind. And they act on this state of mind in relation to not only the requirements of their job, the responsibilities that they may or may not have, well, or they may have rather, in terms of the community itself, and that allows for these kinds of negative effects and inequalities to persist. So the idea here is that when we're taking a look at Better's model for racism, it really gives us a sense of all of the moving pieces in this historical phenomenon. The idea that we have both individual and institutional forces at work, and there are things that are continuingly or things that rather continue to reinforce some of the ideas that underpin both institutional and individual intent. Things like economic privilege, social privilege, and of course, psychic reward are always feeding into the system. And then the outgrowth is that we see the articulation of justification, the idea that, well, these attitudes and this mode of conduct is justified because. Or we start to see the persistence and further exaggeration of stereotypes and their meaning in a social situation or within the society itself. And then, of course, as I mentioned just a moment ago, we see the negative effects in terms of violence and anger, or the outward expression of bigotry as it relates to individual and group conduct. So, as we continue on with looking at the forces that are at work here, please reflect back to this model because I think it's helpful for us to see how everything is interacting with everything else. And when you take something like the criminal justice system and a lot of the reforms that really everybody, both within and outside of the criminal justice system, identify as needing to happen or needing to move forward. These are things that we can really get a sense of kind of the why. Does the reform need to happen, and what specifically in the society and in its history should be addressed to be able to adequately reform those practices. And a lot of your readings that are associated with this lecture will address these topics as well.